Welcome back to the Powerhouse, everyone. I'm Farrokh Langdana, Director of the Rutgers Executive MBA program known as the Powerhouse. And today we're going to talk about an aspect of the trade war that no one really seems to be talking about. It's not even the elephant in the room, because if there's an elephant in the room, people studiously avoid it. This one, no one seems to be talking about it. And what this is the trade flows combined with the capital flows. Trade deficits are associated with capital flows, and no one seems to be talking about them. So, very simply, here is how it works. We, the US, buy electronics, clothing, shoes, stuff from China. China is happy to take green pieces of paper from us. Green pieces of paper, please note, backed by nothing except the strength, vitality, and security of the United States. There is no gold, as you all know, hopefully, backing the dollar since the Nixon administration, 1971, August 1971. So they're happy to take green pieces of paper, the rest of the world. We get stuff from them. And what do these foreigners do with all these green pieces of paper? They can't eat them. They can't sit on them. Well, they do. The Chinese are sitting on about 2.6 trillion. But mostly, they need to earn some money off that. So they recycle them back to us. So the Chinese lend Uncle Sam the money back. It's recycled back in. It's a capital inflow. And so they buy treasuries, they buy mortgage-backed securities, they buy factories, they buy housing. The money is recycled back. And every afternoon, we usually now, after the subprime crisis, we get about $7 billion from China alone to stay alive. Before the subprime crisis, we used to get $2.9 billion. So when I'm in China with our executive MBAs, the Chinese say, hey, China and America are not two different countries. We are one country. We are called Chimerica. If you go, we go. If we go, you go. We need each other. You must understand that 65% of all the money China has made since Deng Xiaoping opened the door in 1979, 65% of all the money they've made is in green pieces of paper, is in dollars. So that money recycles back. They need us, we need them. And so the point here is that if there is a breakdown in trade, and we are all focusing and we are obsessed with what President Trump said this morning as opposed to this afternoon, which country is getting what tariff, which country is not being suddenly tariffed depending on the last tweet, while we are fixating on the trade war, and of course the trade war is a lose-lose proposition. I don't even need to articulate that. We all know Smoot-Hawley from the 1930s. But what happens here is that if the trade flows get squished or broken or disrupted, you must understand, so will the capital flows. The capital that's coming in here is the mirror of the trade deficit. America's trade deficit has a capital surplus. It cancels out, more or less. And so the capital flows get disrupted. If the capital flows get disrupted and the money stops coming in, our interest rates will rise. It'll happen quickly. It's a scary scenario, and the disruption in trade is almost as detrimental, maybe even more so, at least in my opinion, relative to the disruption in trade flows. This is a very important point. This all began actually in the 1980s with the Reagan administration. The OPEC countries basically were tired of green pieces of paper. We were getting oil from them. They were getting green pieces of paper, and the OPEC countries were going, how many F-4 Phantoms can we buy? How many F-16s? We've got enough. How many M1 Abrams? Enough already. F-104s, F-105s. And so the US government, Reagan administration said, hey, maybe you can park your money in treasuries. And this is how that began. And it was actually a win-win thing, because here you have countries that trade with us. They get to buy a piece of Uncle Sam. And keep in mind, the US Treasury is still, in spite of all our problems and all our tensions here, in the summer of our discontent, 2018, it's still the safest investment on the planet. And it will continue to be so, I hope, for a long time. And so it was a win-win. They could recycle the money, park it back in the US. It began in the Reagan administration. So what I'm going to do now, one more comment I want to make. How long can this happy relationship go on? We buy stuff from them, we give them green pieces of paper, they send it back. As long as our budget deficit divided by our GDP our deficit GDP ratio is under 5%, this whole story, it's called the national savings identity story, is sustainable. We can roll over our bonds forever, as long as the deficit GDP ratio is under 5%. And it is that now. So for now, this story is sustainable, as long as there's no disruption in trade and capital flows. So now I'm going to take this up a notch for all of you who like a little bit of heavy lifting, and we are going to switch to the magic board, and I'm going to show you a couple identities to kind of give you some more ammunition here, and then we'll end with a discussion on the Opium Wars, which is a different kind of deficit financing. Right, here we are at the magic board, and I want to thank Maurice Hunter here of Rutgers Business School IT for setting up this high-tech wizardry here for me. So thank you, Maurice. Okay, for those of you who want a little heavy lifting here, let's look at this national savings identity. And this is actually crucially important. And I was reading The Economist magazine about 2-3 weeks ago. And they actually brought this up. And I realized, you know, I really haven't emphasized this in class enough, and especially on my video blogs enough, hence this discussion. So this is what we make at home, domestic output. These are imports. This is everything we have in our company. We make 10 boards like this, and we import 2 from China. So everything we make, domestic output plus imports. What happens to all that? It's private consumption. We buy some. Capital investment, and please note, this is new plant and equipment. So companies buy some of these boards. Government buys some, and we export some. So subtracting imports from both sides, you have what we make at home. We consume them, domestic production, so this is private consumption here. Capital investment, our companies buy some of these boards, so that's business consumption, government consumption, and foreign consumption. So what we make at home, domestic households buy, businesses buy, government buys, foreigners buy. That's equation 1. This is how the goods are divided up. This is equation 2. It's actually an identity, I should say. This is identity 2. Y is the income from the sale of Y goods. So that's the goods are divided. This is the income from the sale of Y goods. So we spend some of this income, we save some of this income, and Uncle Sam sadly takes some of it as taxes. And so there you are, 2 identities. Many of you have seen this, students of mine especially. That's the famous national savings identity. But let's rearrange this, and trust me, there is no sleight of hand here. Play around with this at home for a couple of minutes. You can rearrange it. And this is what I want to talk about. And this is what The Economist magazine was referring to a couple of 3 weeks ago. So first of all, this is very important because what I'm about to tell you now, all economists agree with. Supply-siders, Keynesians, both. They agree to only 2 things, free trade and the national savings identity. And this one here, because there's hardly any economics here, it's an accounting identity. So unambiguous, incontrovertible, no sleight of hand, very important. So imports minus exports, if that's greater than 0, that's your trade deficit. And here you go. And technically, it's the current account deficit. Please note, so technical definition is current account. The current account includes services too. The trade deficit only includes goods that clear customs, but we can use this interchangeably. So here's a trade deficit if it's greater than 0, imports greater than exports. And look at the right-hand side. If G minus T is greater than 0, that means that's your budget deficit. Government spending is larger than taxes or tax revenues. When the government spending is larger than tax revenues, that's a federal budget deficit, which has to be financed by borrowing. So that's a budget deficit, federal budget deficit, government demand for borrowing. I is private demand for borrowing. That's Johnson & Johnson borrowing $20 million for a new lab with magic boards like these. So private demand for borrowing. Housing, by the way, is in here. So government deficits, so it's government demand for borrowing, private demand for borrowing. So this whole thing here is total demand for borrowing. minus savings. This is national savings. So this is the supply of lending. Okay, so here we are. Look at this. If this is greater than 0, if this whole thing is, say, 10, and this thing is 3, that is 7, and this 7 would be basically a shortfall of loanable funds. So essentially, what you have here in this simple diagram, and this kind of mimics what's happening in a country for many years now, is that the total demand for borrowing here exceeds the national supply of savings, and we have an excess demand for borrowing, 7. Why is that equal to the trade deficit? Because that's what I was saying earlier. The trade deficit, and listen very carefully, folks, if you turn a trade deficit over, turn it around, you get a capital inflow. So this baby here is also a capital inflow. It's the flip side of a trade deficit. And that's the point I was making earlier. Our trade deficits are also capital inflows that fund this imbalance here between the total demand for borrowing and the total national savings. And if there's a disruption in trade, thanks to these whimsical, off-the-cuff tariffs and trade wars and anti-dumping duties that appear and disappear twice a day sometimes, disruption in trade would be problematic. It would cause the interest rates to rise. And this expression tells it all. And this is, again, incontrovertible. Both economists, Keynesian supply-siders, they both agree with this. So with this little digression in the identity, let me just end on a historical note and talk about our national savings identity in the context of past forms of funding, such as what the English did in the Opium Wars. So let me put all this in historical perspective. But before I do that, everyone, email me anytime. You have any questions, you need any clarification, you need further explanation. You can see my email address there. Any questions on the Rutgers Executive MBA program, the Powerhouse? That information's up there too, or the Rutgers Business School. Also, there should be a link to all my past video blogs. So do check the timing of the blogs. You know, I'm not one of those after-the-fact economists where the blog comes up after the news is already out. I usually try and stay ahead of the curve. So check all that out. All right, historical perspective. So here we have foreigners who are lending us money, which is, recycled back thanks to the trade deficit capital flows. They're buying a piece of America, Treasury, the most safest investment in the world. And actually that's a good thing. This is, and from a macroeconomic perspective, it really is a win-win. And most people don't understand. This is actually a benevolent form, if you will, of deficit financing. Really a win-win. Compare this to the malevolent form of deficit financing that happened in the 1840s. And I'm on thin ice here. I hope I don't step on anyone's toes, but it happened. The English and the Chinese in the Opium Wars, 1840s. So in a few minutes, like in two, here we have the Brits were getting ceramics, silk, tea from China. Chinese were getting pounds, and Chinese were finally balking at pounds. Like, what could they do with so many pounds? I mean, what could they buy? And they were saying, enough already. If you want to send gold, that's fine. But so the Brits had to find a way to recycle the money back. And please note, there were many reasons for what I'm about to say. This was a macroeconomic version of the Opium Wars, which is where I'm heading. So the Brits had to recycle the money back. How to do it? Well, get the Chinese hooked on opium. But they couldn't use English-registered ships, so they actually used ships from other countries to ship the opium to China. And so the Chinese then were buying tons of this opium, smuggled in actually, it was illegal, and the pounds were making their way back home. It was a malevolent form of budget deficit financing. The emperor, of course, tried to put an end to it, found a chancellor of some kind who destroyed 20,000 cases of opium in Canton, if I remember right, in 1842, thereabouts. Anyway, the whole thing escalated out of control, and the Chinese rebelled, And for one of the few times in human history, we had the Americans, the British, the Germans, the French, the Turks, several more countries, I'm sure, in there, all uniting to destroy the rebellion. So there were 2 opium wars, and the old summer palace in Beijing, which hardly any tourists see, was torn down and looted and burnt. So even to this day, the seeds of the Chinese xenophobia, which some claim China has, go back to this old summer palace. They go back to the opium wars. They go back to this malevolent form of deficit financing. And so it's important to know this part of history, because that explains a lot of what we are seeing now. Nevertheless, our version is much better. Come buy our treasuries, and as long as we can keep that deficit GDP ratio under 5%, it's a win-win for a long time to come. So thanks for being with me. Welcome to the Powerhouse, and I'll see you again in a few weeks. Thank you.